The little girl shouldn't have been on that highway. 8 years old, barefoot on a gravel shoulder, watching a Harley-Davidson cartwheel across asphalt at 60 miles per hour. The sound, metal screaming against pavement, glass dissolving into nothing. She would never forget that sound. Not at 18, not at 30, never. The rider landed in the ditch 12 feet from where she stood. Big man, leather cut soaked black with blood, face like a war map. He turned his head, found her eyes, and said the thing no dying man should ever say to a child. Run. She didn't run. She knelt down in the gravel and pressed both tiny hands against the wound in his side and held on. That decision would change everything. If you've never seen a frightened child save a dying man, stay with me, because this story is going to take you somewhere real, somewhere raw, somewhere that reminds you exactly what human beings are capable of when the whole world has already walked away. Hit that like button, drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight, and do not leave before the end, because what happens next? Nobody sees coming. The highway didn't have a name worth remembering. Route 9 in the inland counties of California, that stretch of two-lane asphalt that runs between burned-out orchards and trailer parks, and the kind of nothing that accumulates in places where the economy quit 20 years ago and never came back. In October, the light came down at an angle that made everything look amber and exhausted, the way old photographs look when the color has been slowly cooking out of them for decades. Avery Quinn was walking the shoulder of that highway because the bus hadn't come. This was not unusual. The bus serving Delano Heights Elementary ran on its own private logic, appearing on Tuesdays and disappearing on Thursdays for reasons the district office could never satisfactorily explain to Rachel Quinn, who had filed 3 formal complaints and received 3 form letters thanking her for her patience. Avery had learned to carry water and a granola bar in the front pocket of her backpack because the walk home was 2 miles and her mother worked the 3 to 11 shift at Mercy Regional, which meant nobody was waiting and nobody was watching, and the highway was whatever it was on any given afternoon. Lonely, flat, indifferent. She was 8 years old and she was not afraid of the highway. She was afraid of other things. The smell of cigarettes in the hallway outside apartment 4C. The man who sometimes sat in his car outside their building until 2 in the morning. The way her mother's hand shook when she thought Avery wasn't watching. Those were the things that lived in the back of her throat. The highway was just pavement. She heard the motorcycle before she saw it. The sound came from the south, and it was not the steady purr of a cruiser running easy on a clear road. It was something else. A high, strained note that rose above the normal register and kept rising, the kind of sound an engine makes when it's being asked to do more than physics allows. Avery stopped walking. She turned. The bike came over the low-rise half a mile back, doing something north of 80. And even at that distance, even at 8 years old, she understood that something was wrong. The rider was fighting the machine. The front wheel oscillated twice across the center line, and then the rear tire caught a rut or a crack or nothing at all. Just the particular bad luck that lives in certain stretches of asphalt. And the bike went sideways. The sound of a Harley-Davidson coming apart at speed is not what people expect. It is not a single crash. It is a sequence. The first hard contact, the shriek of chrome on blacktop, then the secondary tumble when the machine and the rider separate and pursue their own individual trajectories. The gas tank caught something solid in the second roll and the fuel ignited briefly, a low orange flash that died almost immediately in the October wind. The motorcycle ended up in the drainage ditch on the east side of the road. The rider ended up 12 feet from Avery Quinn. She should have run. That was the correct response. Any adult would have confirmed it. Back away from an accident. Stay clear of fuel and heat. Find a phone. Get help. Do not approach a scene of violence or chaos because you are 8 years old and you weigh 53 pounds and the world is enormous and dangerous and not designed to protect children who wander into its wreckage. She didn't run. The man in the ditch was enormous. That was the first thing she registered. Not the blood, which was considerable, not the leather cut that had been partially shredded by the pavement, not the Harley boots with the left one bent wrong, but the sheer physical scale of him. He was 6'3" on a normal day, and even collapsed in a drainage ditch, he occupied more space than seemed reasonable. His face was... She didn't have a word for it at 8, but the word would come later. Mapped. Like something that had been redrawn several times over the years, the original contours still visible beneath the accumulated geography of old breaks and older scars. His eyes opened. They were very dark, and they found her immediately, which frightened her more than the blood did, because the eyes were lucid. He was not confused. He was not lost. He looked at her with complete, terrible clarity. "Run," he said. His voice was low and damaged. Not from the crash she would eventually understand, but from years of cigarettes and cold air and things that had happened long before this highway and this afternoon. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Avery Quinn knelt down in the gravel and pressed both hands against the tear in his side and held on. He stared at her. Something moved across his face that she couldn't name. Not gratitude. That was too soft a word for what lived in his expression. Something more like incomprehension. Like a man encountering a species he'd been told was extinct. "Kid," he said. "I'm pressing," she said. "Like my mom showed me. You're supposed to press." The blood was warm against her palms. She didn't look at it. "How old are you?" 8. Something shifted in his jaw. "You need to go." "My mom works at Mercy Regional," Avery said. "I know what a bad bleed looks like." He was quiet. The wind moved through the dead grass at the edge of the ditch. Somewhere in the middle distance, an irrigation pump knocked against its housing in an irregular rhythm that almost sounded like a heartbeat. "What's your name?" he said. "Avery." "Gage," he said. And that was all he told her. His head went back against the ground and his eyes stayed on the sky, and Avery Quinn held pressure against the wound in his side and screamed for help at the empty highway until a produce truck coming south saw the wreckage and pulled over. She screamed for help, but she didn't let go. The hospital was County General, not Mercy Regional, which was the only small mercy in the entire situation. Rachel Quinn did not walk into her shift that evening and find her daughter's blood on the intake floor. She found out the way parents always find out when they are working and their children are bleeding. A phone call. A voice that was professionally calm in the way that means the opposite. A request to come to the emergency bay as quickly as possible. Avery was not badly hurt. Gravel abrasions on both knees from the ditch. A bruise on her shoulder where she'd pressed too hard against the chain link and hadn't noticed. Her hands had been cleaned, but the EMT on scene had noted in the report that there had been significant volume of blood, not patient's own, which was the clinical way of saying that a 53-pound child had spent 20 minutes in a ditch holding a man together. Rachel sat in the plastic chair beside her daughter's curtained bay and looked at her for a long time without speaking. "He told me to run," Avery said. "I know," Rachel said. "I didn't want to." "I know that too." Rachel Quinn was 31 years old, and she looked 38, which was the math that happened when you raised a child alone and worked rotating shifts and paid rent in a market designed to ensure that the people who kept hospitals running couldn't afford to live anywhere near them. She was not a large woman, 5'4", slight, with the particular tension in her shoulders and jaw that came from years of constant readiness, the body's permanent adaptation to the possibility that the next thing would require more of her than the last. Her hair was dark and always up, secured by whatever was within reach. She wore the same 3 pairs of scrubs in rotation, and she owned exactly one dress, which she wore to Avery's school events and kept on the back of the closet door in a dry cleaning bag from 2019. She held her daughter's hands in her lap, clean now, and turned them over once, and then set them down. "Is he going to be okay?" Avery asked. "I don't know, baby." "He was really scared." Rachel looked at her daughter. "He told you that?" "No," Avery said. "But I could tell." They were quiet for a moment. Down the hall, a monitor alarmed and was silenced. "When do people get scared like that?" Avery asked. Rachel thought about it. She was an honest woman. It was one of her defining qualities and also one of the things that made her life harder than it might have been. She could not offer comfortable untruths to her daughter, even when comfortable untruths would have been easier for both of them. "When they've had something to lose," she said, and then lost it. She didn't find out who Gage Mercer was until 3 days later, when the county social worker knocked on the door of apartment 3B at Delano Heights and explained, in the particular careful language that social workers use when they are delivering information that has multiple implications, That the man Avery had helped on Route 9 had requested to know the name and address of the child who'd held pressure on his wound, and that the Iron Saints Motorcycle Club had filed that request formally with the hospital administration, and that the hospital was obligated to inform the family before making any disclosure. "The Iron Saints," Rachel said. "Yes, ma'am." She'd heard the name. In this part of California, you heard the name. Not because they advertised, they didn't particularly, but because absence of noise is its own form of information, and certain kinds of trouble simply did not happen in the counties where the Iron Saints were known to operate. That was a fact. It was a fact people discussed in specific ways, quietly, cautiously, with the tone of people who understood that acknowledgement was not the same as endorsement. "What do they want?" Rachel asked. "He wants to thank her," the social worker said. "The man she helped, the club president." Rachel looked at her daughter, who was sitting at the kitchen table eating cereal and pretending not to listen with the focused intensity of a child who is listening to every single word. "No," Rachel said. "Of course," the social worker said. "That's completely within your—" "Thank you," Rachel said and closed the door. She stood with her back against it for a moment. The apartment was what it was, a functional space organized around the elimination of waste. No item in it occupied space without serving a purpose. The furniture was clean but old. The light was fluorescent and honest. Through the window above the kitchen sink, you could see the parking lot and the dumpsters in the back of the Quick Mart on 7th. And if you were standing in exactly the right spot at exactly the right time, you could also see the bus stop where Avery caught the 47 on the mornings it decided to run. She told herself she'd done the right thing. She told herself that 3 more times over the next 48 hours, which was the interval between the social worker's visit and the sound of motorcycles. 80 Harleys. She would count them later. That night, standing at her second-floor window at 11:15 with Avery asleep behind the bedroom door and the complex's parking lot normally quiet at that hour, she thought it was perhaps 30. Then more came around the corner of Beaumont Street. Then more. The sound built like weather. First the distant register that could be something else, then the unmistakable bass note of big V-twins running at low speed, and then the full, physical, chest cavity-filling presence of a column of motorcycles filling every available inch of her parking lot and spilling out onto the street. They cut their engines, almost all of them, in something close to unison. The silence that followed was louder than the sound had been. In the context of that many motorcycles and that many men, silence was not absence. It was attention. She could see them from the window, leather cuts, most of them. The Iron Saints patch. She could make out the design from the second floor, a figure that might have been a saint or a soldier, rendered in a style that was more brutal than reverent. The men varied in age and build, but shared a certain quality of stillness that she associated with people who had learned to wait. Veterans had it. Trauma survivors had it. People who had sat with a great deal of uncertainty and decided to make peace with not knowing what came next. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered it because the alternative was standing at the window watching 80 motorcycles occupy her parking lot, which seemed like the more unnerving option. "Ms. Quinn." The voice was the same damaged instrument she'd heard described by her daughter in the hospital. Lower on the phone, slightly. "My name is Gage Mercer." "I know who you are," she said. "I want to talk to you." "I'm aware." "I'd rather do it at your door than under your window." She looked out at the parking lot. One of the men at the front, tall, slightly bent at the shoulder as if permanently braced against something, was holding a phone to his ear. Even from the second floor at night, she could see the side of his face and the shape of the scar that ran from his jaw toward his ear. "You brought 80 men," she said. "I know how that looks." "Do you?" A brief silence. "They're not here to threaten you. They're here because—" He paused. "Because I told them what your daughter did. And this is how they said they wanted to respond." Rachel looked at the parking lot. She looked at the men standing between the motorcycles, some of them old enough to be her father, some younger than she was, all of them standing with the same waiting stillness, facing up toward the building's windows without aggression, without posturing. Just standing, just present. 5 minutes, she said, in the parking lot, not inside. Understood. She put on a jacket over her scrubs and went downstairs. He was taller than she'd expected, even knowing he was tall. That was the first thing, the sheer physical scale of him, which she'd been told about but which still required adjustment. The second thing was the stitching along his side, visible where his flannel shirt gapped slightly above his waistband, 12 to 15 sutures, at minimum, in a wound that should have had him horizontal and medicated for another week at least. He was standing under the parking lot's one functional floodlight. The other 80 men had created a loose perimeter that was not a crowd and not a formation. Something in between, something that said, "We are here," without saying anything more specific than that. "Thank you for coming down," he said. "I have a daughter upstairs," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know. And I want to be clear that I'm a nurse, which means I understand biology and I understand that a man with that incision should not be standing in a parking lot at midnight." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "My surgeon mentioned that." "So this is important enough to ignore that advice?" "Yes." Rachel crossed her arms. "Say what you came to say." He looked at her for a moment with those dark, very clear eyes. Up close, the scar on his face was more complex than it had appeared from the window. It was not one scar, but several, accumulated over time and from different sources. The kind of facial map that spoke to a life that had included a great deal of contact with things that were not supposed to make contact with faces. "She saved my life," he said. "Your daughter. She wouldn't leave, and she held pressure on a bleed that would have killed me in another 10 minutes. He paused. I don't have a frame for that. I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it," Rachel said. "She's 8. She did what she knew how to do." "I know." He looked at the ground briefly, then back up. "I lost a family, long time ago. I'm not explaining that right." He stopped, started again. "I've been writing for a long time, and the people around me are people who understand certain things about how the world works, and certain things about what you can and can't count on. Your daughter pressed her hands against a stranger and refused to move. That's not..." He stopped again. Rachel waited. "She saved my life," he said again, simply. "That makes her family. That's all I wanted to say." She didn't respond immediately. The parking lot was very quiet. Somewhere beyond the perimeter of motorcycles, a traffic light clicked through its sequence on Beaumont Street, pointlessly, because there were no cars. "What does that mean?" she said. "Practically. What does family mean to the Iron Saints?" "It means nobody bothers you," he said. "It means if something's wrong and you need help, you call and someone comes. It means she doesn't walk Route 9 alone anymore." Rachel looked at him. "She's not going to stop walking that highway." "No," he said, "but she won't be alone on it." She stood in the cold parking lot for another moment, looking at this enormous, damaged, carefully upright man who had driven himself out of a hospital bed to stand under a broken floodlight and say thank you in the only language he apparently knew, which was presence. "Go home," she said finally. "Rest that wound, and tell your men thank you for whatever this is." "Yes, ma'am," he said. She went back upstairs. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and didn't drink it, and listened to 80 Harleys start up in sequence and roll out of the parking lot, and by the time the sound faded, Avery was standing in the bedroom doorway in her pajamas with her hair loose. "Was that him?" Avery asked. "Go to bed," Rachel said. "Was it?" Rachel looked at her daughter for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "Go to bed." She sat at the table for a long time after that. October became November. The signs were small, which was how Rachel missed them at first. The loose hinge on the complex's main entrance door, the one that had been filed with building management in August and twice in September, was repaired overnight between a Tuesday and a Wednesday without announcement. The motion sensor light in the stairwell that had been dark since July came on when she climbed the stairs to her apartment that same week. She asked the building super. He said maintenance had done it. The maintenance company, when she followed up, had no record of either repair. The grocery run on the second Thursday of November. She'd parked on Clement Street, 2 blocks from the discount market she used because their unit prices were better than Safeway. And when she came out with 2 bags and the cold was the kind of cold that felt personal, a man in a leather cut was leaning against the building across the street, smoking, apparently finding the middle distance deeply interesting. She stopped. He looked at her, gave a single, very small nod, and looked away. She stood on the sidewalk with 2 bags of groceries for approximately 4 seconds before she decided that this was not the battle she had capacity for tonight, and walked to her car. She did not call Gage Mercer. She did not have his number. They'd exchanged nothing in the parking lot except words. But she suspected that if she asked Avery, Avery would somehow have it, and this suspicion was accurate, and also it was not a suspicion she tested because testing it would have required an acknowledgement she wasn't ready to make. The man who followed Avery home from school, this was the one that changed the calculation. November 14th. Avery had stayed late for the reading group that met on Mondays and Thursdays, which meant she left the school at 4:15 instead of 2:30, and the afternoon had gone gray early the way it does in the valley in November, the light already dying when the final bell rang. Rachel found out from Mrs. Okafor, the reading group supervisor, who called the apartment that evening with the particular bright, careful quality in her voice that means a person is relaying information they believe is important and are not sure how you're going to receive it. A man had been watching the school's east gate from a parked car. A dark Chrysler 300, late model, parked where loading zones prevent clear sight lines from the front office. Mrs. Okafor had noticed it because it was there when she arrived at 7:15 and still there at 4:30 when the last students left. She'd written down the plate because she was the kind of teacher who wrote down plates, and she'd asked the school secretary to pass the description to the district security coordinator, but she wanted the parents to know. The car had left when Avery did. Mrs. Okafor had not seen anyone following Avery, but she had walked her to the bus stop herself, and she had watched the Chrysler 300 pull into traffic 4 vehicles behind the bus. Rachel sat with the phone in her hand after the call ended. She sat with it for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Then she called the number in Avery's backpack. Tab. He answered on the second ring. Someone's watching her school, she said. No pause. What kind of vehicle? She gave him what she had. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quality of that silence she heard something she didn't expect. Not surprise, which would have been alarming in one direction, and not casualness, which would have been alarming in another. What she heard was recognition, the silence of a man encountering information that slots into a pattern he's already been building. You know what this is, she said. Another silence, shorter. I don't know yet. That's not the same thing as not having a theory. A pause. Ms. Quinn? Rachel. Rachel, I need to ask you to trust me for a few days. That's a significant request from someone I've met once. I know. She looked at the kitchen table. The linoleum around the table leg was beginning to lift at one corner. She'd been meaning to fix it for 6 weeks. Is she in danger? Rachel said. The pause was 3 seconds long. She counted. I'm going to make sure she isn't, he said. That is not what I asked. Another pause. Yes, he said. Maybe. I don't know how much. I need to find out. She had expected him to say no. The honesty surprised her sufficiently that it took her a moment to respond. What do I do? She said. Nothing different, he said. Go to work. Take Avery to school. Act normal. Just don't be anywhere you don't have to be after dark alone. I'm a shift nurse. I'm alone after dark 3 nights a week. Not anymore, he said. She should have argued. In the morning, she would construct several excellent arguments for why she should have argued, about autonomy and precedent and the specific danger of allowing a motorcycle club to insert itself into your daily schedule, however benign the insertion appeared. She would construct those arguments at 5 a.m. with a cup of coffee, and she would find them all very convincing. That night, on the phone, in the kitchen, she said, "Okay." She hung up. She looked at the lifting corner of linoleum for a long time. Then she went and knocked on Avery's bedroom door and told her daughter that she loved her. And Avery said, "Love you too, Mom," in the tone of a child who has been interrupted mid-chapter. And Rachel went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the parking lot. The dark Chrysler 300 was registered to a shell company in Fresno. It took the Iron Saints contact in the county assessor's office 3 days to trace the registration backward through 2 corporate layers to a name that Gage recognized, and the recognition settled into his chest like a stone dropped into deep water. Heavy, slow, the ripple spreading before the impact fully registered. Damon Cruz had been a business associate in the traditional sense of a phrase that, in the world Gage occupied, meant something more specific than it did in a boardroom. Cruz was not the man at the top of this. Cruz had never been the man at the top of anything. He was a middle instrument, a mechanism for connecting intent to action without the originator's fingerprints appearing at the scene. And the man who used him, who had always used him, for longer than Gage wanted to calculate, was Victor Kane. He didn't tell the Iron Saints everything. That was a calculation, and like all calculations, it would later prove to have carried assumptions he hadn't adequately examined. But in the first week of November, with Rachel working nights and Avery being walked to school by a rotation of Iron Saints brothers, who managed the task with the invisibility of men long accustomed to surveillance and counter-surveillance, he told himself he had time, that Kane was being cautious, that the Chrysler and the Plate and the Shell Company were intelligence gathering, not operation launching. He told himself he had time. He fixed the kitchen faucet on a Tuesday afternoon. He had not planned to fix the kitchen faucet. He'd been in the parking lot. He'd been in the parking lot a great deal over the past 3 weeks, a fact that Rachel acknowledged with a particular tightening around her eyes that was not quite gratitude and not quite challenge. And she'd mentioned, not to him specifically, to no one specifically, that the cold water tap had been dripping since September and the building super had a 3-week response time. He'd said, without fully deciding to, that he could fix it. She'd looked at him. "You can fix a faucet," she said. "Grew up doing it," he said. Another one of those pauses that she deployed with surgical precision. "Tuesday, I'm off until 3. Tuesday, he arrived at 9 with a parts bag from the hardware store on 5th. The apartment in daylight was different than it was in the nighttime parking lot or over a phone. It was very clean and very spare. Not poor, he thought, but considered, every object in it chosen or kept for a reason. A drawing was held to the refrigerator with a butterfly magnet. Avery's, a horse drawn with considerable technical seriousness and almost no interest in proportion. Enormous head, determined expression. A stack of nursing textbooks on the counter, their spines cracked and annotated. A single photograph on the wall by the hallway. Rachel and Avery at what looked like a state fair, both of them holding corn dogs, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. He fixed the faucet in 20 minutes. The cartridge was original to the unit and the building was probably 25 years old, which meant the part cost $4 and the work was straightforward. When he was done, Rachel made coffee and he sat at the kitchen table with the mug she put in front of him, and the silence between them was the kind of silence that has texture to it, not uncomfortable, but aware. "How's the side?" she said. "Fine. You're favoring it. Habit." She sat across from him with her own mug. The late morning light came through the kitchen window at a low angle and touched the table edge and the side of the coffee cup, and that was all. Outside, the parking lot was empty and gray. "What did you lose?" she asked. He looked at her. She looked back, not flinching. "When you were talking," she said, "in the parking lot, you said you lost a family." The silence that followed was different from the comfortable kind. "A daughter," he said. "Her name is Lena." He stopped. Her name is Lena. "You don't see her. She doesn't want to see me." He looked at the coffee. "Can't say she's wrong." Rachel said nothing. This was one of the things he was beginning to understand about her, that she did not fill silence with noise, which was a rarer quality than it appeared, and one that he found, after the first 2 or 3 encounters, almost unbearably clarifying. "She's 26, he said. "She grew up watching me choose the club over everything, over her mother, before her mother left." He turned the mug once on the table. "You make choices when you're young and you think you understand the math of them, and then you get old enough to see what the math actually produced, and the math is different than you expected." "Do you still make those choices?" she said. "Which ones?" "The ones that cost other people." He looked at her. The light moved slightly as the October clouds shifted outside. "I don't know," he said. "I'm trying not to." "That's not the same as a no." "No," he said. "It's not." She drank her coffee, he drank his. The refrigerator hummed and the drawing of the horse observed them from its butterfly magnet, and outside in the parking lot, nothing moved. "Avery talks about you," she said. He didn't say anything. She thinks you're like a character in a book, Rachel said. The kind that doesn't know they're the good one. He set down his mug. He looked at the table. He had, over the course of his life, received gratitude in a variety of forms, and he had received threat and challenge and assessment, but he had not for a long time received something that was simply true and simply said with no agenda underneath it. He picked up his mug and drank the coffee and didn't answer because the answer was too large for the kitchen and he wasn't sure he had the right words for it, even if the space had existed. He came back on Friday to repair the door frame. He hadn't been invited for the door frame. He'd noticed on Tuesday that the strike plate was wrong. The door closed but didn't align correctly with the bolt, which meant the deadbolt wasn't fully engaging, which meant the apartment's primary lock was approximately 60% functional. He didn't say anything on Tuesday because she'd have asked how he knew about door frames and locks, and the gap in security they produced, and the answer would have been a longer conversation than a faucet visit warranted. On Friday, he arrived with a drill and a longer screw set and spent 15 minutes correcting the alignment and said nothing about why. She watched him work. This was new. Before, she'd been in the kitchen or in the other room within earshot, not absent but not present in the specific way she was present now. Standing at the edge of the living room with her second coffee of the day, watching him work on her door with a set of Robertson screws and a level she hadn't asked him to bring. "You knew about the lock," she said. "Noticed Tuesday. You didn't say anything. Didn't want to—" He paused. "Didn't want to make it into something. And coming back to fix it without being asked," she said. "That's not making it into something." He turned and looked at her. She had the same expression she'd used in the parking lot. Not hostile, not warm, but very direct. The expression of a person who has learned to measure exactly what space she can afford to occupy and has no interest in being crowded. "Fair point," he said. She was quiet for a moment, then, "Do it anyway." He turned back and finished the screws. Avery came home from school at 3:15 that Friday, accompanied as she had been for 2 weeks by a quiet Iron Saints prospect named Tommy, who managed the escort with the casual ease of a young man who had spent years learning to be unremarkable. Avery had decided, after approximately 3 days of this arrangement, that Tommy was her friend, and Tommy had accepted this with the stoic resignation of a man who had not anticipated that his assignment would require opinions on the relative qualities of various horse breeds. She came into the apartment, dropped her backpack by the door, with a force that suggested the backpack had personally wronged her, saw Gage on one knee by the door frame, and stopped. "You fixed the lock," she said. "Strike plate," he said. "Is that the same thing?" "Related." She considered this. She dropped her jacket on the backpack, apparently because it had also wronged her. "Are you staying for dinner?" she asked. "Avery," Rachel said. "We have leftover chili," Avery said. "There's a lot." Gage looked at Rachel. Rachel looked at Gage. There was a particular moment in this exchange, a very small window, in which something was communicated without language. Something about the precise boundary between gratitude and normalcy, and the space where one becomes the other, and whatever was communicated in that window, the result of it was that Rachel turned and went to the kitchen and took the container of chili from the refrigerator. He stayed for dinner. He sat at the table where he'd drunk coffee on Tuesday and ate chili from a bowl that had a small chip in the rim from some prior impact and listened to Avery explain, in detailed and passionate terms, why the American quarter horse was categorically superior to the Arabian in terms of temperament. And he asked 3 questions that were apparently the right questions because she answered them at length and with mounting enthusiasm, and ate her dinner without being reminded to, and Rachel ate across the table and didn't say much. And when she looked up, her expression was something he couldn't quite name, but that he filed away carefully, the way you file away things that might turn out to matter. He left at 8. Tommy, parked across the street, gave him a nod when he came down the stairs. The night was cold and clear and very still. He stood beside his bike for a moment before he started it. He stood there longer than necessary. Then he started the bike and rode out of the parking lot and didn't look back, which was the only discipline he had left to enforce on himself in that particular moment, and even that cost him more than it should have. The threat came in the form of a note. November 22nd, a Tuesday, 5 days before Thanksgiving. Rachel found it under the windshield wiper of her car in the hospital parking structure at the end of her 3 to 11 shift. The structure was the usual kind, Fluorescent lights in 6 of 8 bays, working, security camera at the elevator bank that the hospital had been promising to extend since before Rachel started working there. The particular smell of exhaust and concrete and the specific cold of enclosed spaces that don't heat properly. She almost didn't read it. She almost crumpled it and threw it in the passenger side pocket as the usual drift of flyers and notices that collected under wipers in parking structures. But something about the folding stopped her. It was precise, deliberate, the fold of paper that someone has taken care with. Inside, in typed print, "Tell the man who fixed your door that his time is borrowed. Every person around him pays the debt he owes, the child especially." She sat in the parking structure for 4 minutes. Then she drove home at a speed slightly above the limit, parked, went upstairs, checked Avery. Asleep, undisturbed, the horse drawing still on the refrigerator, the correctly aligned deadbolt engaged. And then she called the number. He answered on the first ring this time. "He's moving," she said. Gage's voice was immediately, completely different. The texture she'd been learning to read, the careful, damaged, careful quality of a man managing himself for an audience of one, was gone. What was left was something older and harder and very still. "Where are you?" "Home. Avery's here. We're fine. Don't open the door for anyone tonight." "Gage," she kept her voice flat, "I need you to tell me what this is." The silence lasted exactly long enough to tell her that the answer was serious. "His name is Victor Kane," he said. And on the other end of the line, she heard something she had not heard in him before. Not fear, exactly, because she was not certain this man was configured for conventional fear, but something adjacent to it. The sound of a man who has run the numbers on a situation and does not like the answer. "Who is he to you?" she said. "Someone I thought I was done with," Gage said. 17 years ago. I was wrong." The refrigerator hummed. The horse drawing observed her from its magnet. Outside, somewhere past the parking lot and the Quick Mart and the empty Beaumont Street, something moved in the dark that she couldn't see and couldn't name, and every instinct she'd developed in 31 years of a life that had required her to be very good at assessing danger was telling her the same thing. This was not finished. This was not close to finished. This was just the beginning. The name sat between them like a third presence in the room. Victor Kane. Rachel said it back to him once, quietly, testing the weight of it. Gage said nothing on the other end of the line. She could hear him breathing, slow, deliberate, the measured rhythm of a man who had learned a long time ago that the body will betray panic if you let it, so you don't let it. She had seen that kind of breathing in the ER, combat veterans. Men who'd come through things they hadn't processed and probably never would. Men who'd made the body into an instrument of control because everything else had gotten away from them. "Tell me what I need to know tonight," she said. "Not everything. What I need right now." "Don't go anywhere you haven't been before," he said. "Don't change your routine. If something feels wrong, a car, a person, anything, you call me before you decide it's nothing." "And Avery, Tommy doesn't leave her sight tomorrow. She has a field trip." A pause. "Where?" "Museum of Natural History in Fresno. School bus." Another pause, longer. "I'll have someone on the bus route." Rachel looked at the note on the kitchen table, the precise fold of it, the particular care, the child especially. "He knows about her," she said. "He knows about everything," Gage said. "That's what he does." "Then why are we pretending the routine is safe?" "Because the moment you break the routine, he knows he's gotten to you, and that's what he wants." His voice dropped slightly. "He feeds on disruption, on watching people collapse their own lives trying to run from him. The routine is armor. Understand?" She understood. She didn't like it, but she understood it. And this was another thing she was cataloging about Gage Mercer, that his logic, when he chose to deploy it, was sound. Not reassuring, not designed to comfort, just accurate. "Get some sleep," he said. "You too." A pause that lasted exactly 1 beat too long. "Yeah," he said. She knew he wouldn't. She hung up and looked at the note, and then folded it again along its original creases and put it in the kitchen drawer under the takeout menus and turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dark apartment for a moment listening to her daughter breathe in the next room. The horse drawing was a shadow on the refrigerator in the dark. She went to bed. She didn't sleep for 2 hours. When she did, she dreamed about a parking lot full of motorcycles with their engines all running and no riders anywhere. The Iron Saints Clubhouse was a converted machine shop on the east side of Bakersfield, which meant it was in the part of the city that the city had essentially stopped paying attention to. The industrial corridor where the street lighting was sparse and the buildings were big and anonymous, and the kind of activity that happened after midnight did so without interference. The machine shop still looked like a machine shop from the outside. Inside, it had been converted over 20 years into something that was part war room, part kitchen, part infirmary, and part the kind of living space occupied by men who had stopped expecting comfort and started expecting function. Gage called a church, the club's term for a mandatory meeting of fully patched members, at 7 the next morning. He stood at the head of the scarred wooden table that had been in this room for 15 years and looked at the men assembled around it and felt the specific exhaustion of a president who has been holding information back from his own club. 14 men. The full council. Decker on his left, vice president, 44 years old, built like a fireplace, a man whose default expression was a sustained assessment of every person in his vicinity that had served him extremely well across 30 years of operating in spaces where misjudgment was expensive. Next to Decker, Cruz, not the Damon Cruz of the Chrysler 300, but Marco Cruz, the club's road captain, who shared the name with the enemy's instrument and had never found this amusing. Priest, the sergeant-at-arms, who was called Priest not because of any inclination toward the sacred, but because of the particular quality of silence he could produce that made people confess things they hadn't intended to say. 7. The oldest member, 61, 3 wars worth of damage, distributed across his body in a way that had never fully healed and that he never mentioned. And the others ranged around the table with their coffee and their silence and the particular collective attention of men who know that a 7 a.m. church means something they won't entirely enjoy. Gage told them about Cain, not the history, not all of it, the relevant architecture, that Cain had been present 17 years ago at the event that had cost Gage his marriage and his daughter and a portion of his operational judgment that he was still today recovering. That Cain had apparently never considered that cost satisfactory. That the current situation, the Chrysler 300, the note, the watching of a child, was Cain's opening move in something that was not yet fully legible, but whose general shape Gage recognized. The room was quiet for a moment after he finished. Then Decker said, "How long have you known?" His voice was level. This was more frightening than anger would have been. "The plate came back 3 days ago," Gage said. "And before that, the connection to Cain." Gage looked at his vice president. "A week." The silence in the room changed quality. It was the silence of 14 men recalculating something simultaneously, and the thing they were recalculating was the question of what their president had and had not shared with them, and why. This was not a comfortable recalculation. Decker's jaw moved once. "You held it." "I was verifying." "You held it from your own counsel while there's a threat on the table." "I needed to be certain before Before you what?" Decker's voice did not rise. This was the discipline of a man who had learned that volume was the resource of people who'd lost the argument. "Before you decided what we needed to know? That's not your call, Gage. That's never been your call." "It's my call when the information concerns my personal." "There's no personal in this room," Decker said. "You know that. You built that. You sat in that chair and told every man at this table that the club has no private wars, no outside business that doesn't come through counsel. Your words. Your rule." The table was very quiet. Priest was watching Gage with the particular quality of attention he reserved for situations he found genuinely interesting. 7 was looking at his coffee. The others occupied various positions on the spectrum between Decker's open confrontation and 7's careful neutrality. Gage looked at his VP for a long moment. "You're right," he said. Decker absorbed this. He picked up his coffee, drank, set it down. "Tell us everything." Everything took 40 minutes. The room was different at the end of 40 minutes than it had been at the beginning. Information has weight. It changes the atmosphere it enters. What Gage laid out across those 40 minutes was not just the immediate situation, but the history beneath it, the 17-year architecture of a grievance that had apparently been maintained and cultivated by a man with the patience and resources to wait for exactly the right moment to act. Victor Kane had not always been Victor Kane in the sense that the name now carried. 17 years ago, he had been Victor Kessler, a mid-level operator in the supply chain of a larger criminal network that had been attempting to use Iron Saints territory for transit operations. Gage had declined the arrangement. The declining had not gone smoothly. There had been a confrontation, there had been violence, there had been a fire, and at the end of it, 3 men were dead, one of them Kane's younger brother. Gage had not killed the brother. He had killed the man who killed the brother, and had done so in defense of 2 of his own people, and a jury in Kern County had agreed with this account 6 months later after a trial that had cost Gage his marriage, his relationship with Lena, and his peace of mind in that order. Kane had disappeared after the trial. Not run. Disappeared, which was different. A man who runs is afraid. A man who disappears is preparing. 17 years of preparation, apparently. When Gage finished, the room held its silence for a long moment. "He's come for the family," Priest said. Not a question. "He's come for everything," Gage said. "The family is the mechanism." "Because that's what you didn't have 17 years ago," Decker said slowly. "You had the club. He couldn't get to you through the club because the club is a fortress. But now you've got—" He stopped, looked at his coffee. "You've got people outside the walls." "Yes." Another silence. Marco Cruz, road captain, 38, the quietest man in the room on most occasions, spoke for the first time. "The woman, the nurse, and the kid." "Yes." "They know what they're in." "No," Gage said. "Not the full shape of it." "You need to tell them." "I know." "Today," Decker said. "I know." Decker looked at him for a long, level moment. There was something in his VP's face that Gage had seen there only twice before in 20 years of partnership, and it was the expression Decker wore when he was deciding whether he still trusted the man he was looking at. The first time had been after the Kern County trial. The second time had been 3 years ago, when Gage had made a decision about club business that Decker had disagreed with and that had proven, in retrospect, to have cost them more than necessary. Both times, Decker had stayed. Gage watched his VP's face and waited. "We're with you," Decker said finally. "But not blind. Never blind again." "Agreed," Gage said. It was the smallest word he'd spoken in 40 minutes, and it carried more weight than any of the rest. He drove to Delano Heights at noon. Rachel was sitting on the front steps of the building in her off-duty clothes, jeans, a heavy gray sweater with a hole forming at the left cuff that she'd been working at absently with her thumb, drinking coffee from a travel mug and watching the parking lot with the expression of someone who has decided to stop pretending they're not watching. She saw him pull in. She didn't move. He sat down on the step beside her. Not close. One step lower, slightly apart. The configuration of people who are having a serious conversation that neither of them has started yet. "Avery's at school," she said. "I know. Tommy checked in." She drank her coffee. The day was cold and gray, the flat inland gray that has no drama in it, no pending storm, just the absence of warmth. Somewhere above them in the building, a television was audible through a window. Daytime programming, the particular bright synthetic voices of people being cheerful on camera. "You were going to tell me today," she said. "You'd already decided." "Yes." "Tell me." He told her. Not the 40-minute version. The version shaped for a woman who was going to have to make decisions based on it, which meant it needed to be accurate and complete, and presented without the cushioning that would allow her to underestimate it. He told her about Kane's brother, about the trial, about 17 years, about the shape of what was happening now, and his best current assessment of what Kane intended. She listened without interrupting. This was something he'd been noticing about her. She did not interrupt. Most people interrupt. They insert themselves into incoming information to show they're processing it, or to manage their own anxiety about what they're hearing, or simply because waiting is uncomfortable and filling space is reflexive. Rachel Quinn listened to the whole thing, the way a person listens when they understand that the information is more important than their reaction to it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Your daughter, she said. Lena. He looked at her. Of all the elements of the 40-minute version, this was the one he'd most abbreviated. Kane knows about her, Rachel said. That's in this somewhere. It wasn't a question. He'd underestimated her again. He kept doing that, and every time he did it, the recalibration was more significant than the time before. Yes, he said. Where is she? I don't know. He looked at the parking lot. She moved 3 years ago, and I have a P.O. box. We communicate twice a year, maybe. Holidays. Rachel looked at him with the particular expression she wore when she was deciding whether to push. Did you warn her? She said. I've been trying to locate her. That's not... I know, he said. I know it's not the same thing. She looked at him for a long moment. He did not look away. He'd learned early in their acquaintance that looking away from Rachel Quinn in a hard conversation was not a strategy she found acceptable. You keep doing that, she said. What? Protecting everyone else's information before you protect the actual people. The words landed with the specific precision of something true. He felt them in the old injury in his side that never entirely stopped hurting and that he had decided years ago was a form of information rather than a complaint. You're not wrong, he said. I know I'm not. She drank her coffee. What do we do? I want you and Avery to move, short term, somewhere the club can better... No, she said. Rachel, this is our home. Her voice was not loud. It was very flat and very clear. I know it's not much. I know you probably look at this parking lot and this building and think this is what she's protecting. I know how it looks. But Avery has a school here and I have a job here, and I have spent 8 years making this particular corner of nothing into something stable for my daughter, and I am not going to let a man I've never met make me pack her into a garbage bag and run. She stopped. So tell me another option. He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the parking lot full of Harleys on that first night, the 80 men who'd stood in silence under the broken floodlight. He thought about what had moved across his chest when he'd first seen her in the hospital documentation. Not the daughter, the mother. The shape of someone who had been shouldering everything alone for so long that the posture had become architecture. Then we fortify, he said. Tell me what that means. It means the building gets a permanent presence. It means your route to work and back is covered. It means Avery never goes anywhere without someone we trust. Tommy and others, better ones. She nodded once. And Kane. I'm going to find him before he finishes building whatever he's building. You don't know where he is. Not yet. But you have people looking. The best ones I have. She turned the travel mug in her hands. The hole at her cuff had gotten slightly larger. And your daughter, she said. He looked at the parking lot. And my daughter, he said. Lena Mercer was 26 years old and had spent the better part of those years cultivating the specific skill of being unreachable by her father, which was different from being unreachable in general. She had a life, a job, an apartment in Sacramento, friends who knew her as Lena Cole, the name she'd taken from her mother's maiden name when she was 19, and had decided formally and deliberately that the Mercer half of her identity was a coat she no longer intended to wear. Decker found her in 3 days, using methods he didn't fully explain to Gage and that Gage decided, in the interest of the mutual candor agreement they'd just rebuilt, not to press. She was fine. She hadn't noticed anything unusual. She agreed, reluctantly and with the specific flavor of reluctance that came from years of practice, to allow a low-profile watch on her building for a 2-week period, communicated through a text exchange with Decker that Gage was not part of. Decker told him this in the clubhouse on a Thursday evening, standing at the kitchen counter with a beer he wasn't drinking, and Gage sat at the old table and absorbed it. She said to tell you she hopes you're well, Decker said. Gage looked at the table. She didn't say that. No, Decker said. She didn't. He drank the beer. Gage looked at the table. She's okay, Decker said. That's the thing that matters. Yeah. Gage. He looked up. When this is done, Decker said, you need to go to Sacramento. She doesn't want... I know what she wants. I'm telling you what you need. He set the beer down. You've been carrying this family debt for 26 years and spending it on strangers. The Quinn woman, the kid. I'm not saying that's wrong. It's not wrong. I think you know what you're doing there, even if you don't have the words for it yet. But you've got a daughter who's alive and 26 and one text exchange away, and that gap is closable. It just costs something. It costs her, Gage said. Not me. Asking her to close it costs her. Then let her decide that. A silence. She already decided, he said. People change their decisions, Decker said, especially when the person they made the decision about starts being different from who they made it about. Gage said nothing. Decker picked up his beer, looked at it, set it down again. I'm going home, Decker said. Get some sleep. He left. Gage sat at the table for a long time after, in the quiet of the machine shop with the heater knocking in the wall and the smell of old oil and coffee and the specific accumulated atmosphere of 20 years of a particular kind of life, and looked at the table and thought about his daughter's face the last time he'd seen it, which had been 3 years ago in a coffee shop in Sacramento that she'd suggested because it was in a neighborhood she knew and he didn't, and how she'd sat across from him with the particular controlled quality of someone who had prepared for this meeting and was determined to execute it with precision and minimum exposure, and how he'd looked at the shape of her face and seen her mother's cheekbones and his own jawline and the specific combination that was entirely hers and nobody else's, and had understood, sitting there, that his presence in her life was a net negative, and that the most loving thing he could do was be as small in it as possible. He'd believed that. He still mostly believed it. He just wasn't sure anymore whether loving and correct were the same calculation. The sheet. The problem with fortifying a position is that it announces the position. This was the thing Gage understood about Kane's strategy that he hadn't yet found the right language to explain to Rachel, and that he was turning over in his mind on the second Friday of December when the first concrete action happened and the abstract shape of the threat became suddenly, irreversibly specific. The Iron Saints had 3 men on the Delano Heights complex in rotating shifts, 2 visible, parked in the lot, present enough to be seen, intended to function as deterrent, 1 invisible, which was Priest, who had developed over 30 years the particular talent of occupying urban space without registering in peripheral vision. The visible presence was Gage's compromise between Rachel's refusal to relocate and his own understanding that a defended position needs to show its defense to work as prevention. Kane had apparently expected exactly this. The attack didn't come at Delano Heights. It came at Mercy Regional at 10:40 p.m. on a Friday, when Rachel was walking from the nursing station to the east parking structure, the same structure where the note had been left. And the 2 men in the stairwell were waiting with the focused patience of people who had been given very specific instructions and had been paid in advance for following them. She didn't scream. She'd been trained in hospital security protocols, and she knew that screaming in an enclosed stairwell in a parking structure at 10:40 p.m. on a Friday produced a sound that went up and out and dissipated immediately in the cold air without resolution. She fought. She was not a large woman, but she was a nurse, and nurses learn very quickly where the body's vulnerable points are and how to apply precise force to them. And she broke one man's nose with her elbow and got her phone halfway out of her jacket pocket before the second man got her arm. The phone dropped on the stairwell landing. It landed face up. The last thing she managed before her hands were secured behind her was to tap the contact at the top of her recent calls, which was Gage's number, and hit the green button. The call connected. It went to his pocket. He was on the bike, and the call hit the Bluetooth system, and the stairwell picked up, faint and distorted, the sound of a scuffle, and then Rachel's voice, very controlled, saying, "Do not hurt me, and I will not hurt you again. That's a trade. Take it." And then a male voice, flat, professional. "We're not here to hurt you, Ms. Quinn. We're here to deliver a message." Gage heard the stairwell go quiet. He was already stopped on the shoulder of Highway 99, the Harley idling under him, both hands tight on the grips, the cold air making the phone's Bluetooth connection crackle. "What message?" Rachel said. "That the man you've been spending time with has a debt," the voice said, "and debts have a collection date." "I'm not involved in whatever You became involved," the voice said, "the moment he started sitting at your kitchen table." Silence. Then, "Who are you?" "We're just the message," the voice said. "The message is, He has 48 hours to contact our employer directly. After that, the next message gets delivered somewhere less convenient than a parking structure. The sound of footsteps. A door. Silence. Then Rachel's voice, alone, in the stairwell, very steady. I know you're on the line. Come get my phone. He was at the hospital in 19 minutes. He found her in the stairwell, sitting on the third-floor landing with her back against the wall, her phone in her hand and a paper towel pressed to the heel of her palm where the concrete had scraped it when she'd gone down. The fluorescent tube above the landing was flickering in a slow, irregular rhythm, like a light that couldn't decide whether to stay on. He crouched down in front of her and looked at her face. She looked back. I'm fine, she said. I know, he said. Don't do the thing where you check every... I know you're fine, he said quietly. I know. He stayed where he was, crouched at her level, not touching. His hands were loose at his sides. The flickering light made shadows move across the wall behind her. I'm sorry. She looked at him, the careful, direct look. Is that all you have to say? No. He looked at the paper towel on her palm. But it's first. She lowered the paper towel. The scrape was not serious, abraded skin, a small quantity of blood, nothing that needed more than cleaning. She had the kind of relationship with minor injury that nurses develop, clinical, unbothered, assessed, and categorized immediately. He knows where I work, she said. Yes. He knows my shift schedule. Probably. He's been watching longer than the Chrysler 300. Yes. She looked at him. Tell me the whole thing now, Gage. Not the version you calibrate for what you think I can handle. The whole thing. He sat down on the landing beside her, his back against the wall. The stairwell smelled of exhaust from the structure and the particular cold concrete smell that all parking structures share. His knee was 6 inches from hers, not touching. He told her the rest of it. The parts he'd held back not out of calculation, but out of the specific shame that comes from showing someone the full map of your history and understanding that you drew most of the terrain yourself. The trial. What had preceded the trial. The decisions he'd made in his 30s that had been coherent within a framework that he now understood to have been, in certain essential ways, broken. Not wrong in every dimension. He could not honestly say the club had been wrong in every dimension, but broken in the ways that had cost Lena her father, that had cost Sarah, Lena's mother, her marriage, that had left Victor Kane's brother in the position to be killed by the man who should never have been there at all. Rachel listened. The flickering light continued its irregular rhythm above them. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. You're not the same person, she said finally. I'm made of the same material. That's not the same thing. Rachel. A person can be made of difficult material and still become something other than what they were. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the opposite wall of the stairwell. I've been a nurse for 9 years. I've seen people in the worst moments of their lives, car accidents, overdoses, violence, the kind of situations where everything a person is gets stripped down to the functional minimum. And the thing I've learned is that the material doesn't predict the outcome. The decisions do. She paused. You're making different decisions now. Not fast enough, he said. No, she agreed. Not fast enough, but different. She turned and looked at him. That counts. I'm telling you it counts, even when it doesn't feel like it does. He looked at her for a long moment in the flickering light of the parking structure stairwell. She had a smear of dust on her cheek from the wall, and her hair had come down on one side from its clip, and she was the most completely present person he could remember being in a room with in a very long time. Present and honest and entirely unafraid of him in a way that had nothing to do with naivety and everything to do with accuracy. He looked away first. I have to call this in, he said. Kane's people are going to expect contact in 48 hours. I need my people to know what we're working with. What do you say to him, if you call? I don't call. He stood up, offered her a hand. She took it. They both stood, and he didn't let go immediately, and she didn't pull away immediately, and the moment lasted approximately 3 seconds longer than functional necessity required before they both released. I don't call, he said again. I find him first. In 48 hours. In 48 hours? She picked up her bag from the step where it had fallen. She straightened her jacket. The professional quality came back into her posture. The constant readiness, the spine, the set of the jaw. And he thought, watching her reassemble, that there was a word for what he was looking at. And the word was fortitude, the old one. The one that meant not the absence of fear, but the presence of something that outweighs it. My shift ends in 40 minutes, she said. I'm finishing my shift. He started to say something. I'm finishing my shift, she said again, with the specific finality of someone who is not revisiting the statement. Okay, he said. Then I'm going home, and I'm going to sit at my kitchen table, and I'm going to drink coffee, and I'm going to make sure my daughter doesn't know this happened tonight. Okay. And tomorrow you're going to tell me what you need from me so we can end this. He looked at her. You don't need to be part of Gage. Her voice was very quiet and very clear. He put his hands on me in a parking structure to send you a message. I was already part of it. I need you to catch up. The 48-hour clock did not reach zero. At 31 hours, one of the Iron Saints' outer ring contacts, a woman named Deirdre, who ran a roadside diner 11 miles south of Bakersfield on a route that served as an informal information exchange for several parties with varying and sometimes overlapping interests, sent a message to Decker's phone consisting of a single address and the notation, shipment incoming, not product. The address was a farmhouse outside Wasco. Decker and Priest drove it at 4 in the morning, lights off, the truck borrowed from Marco's cousin, everything about them unremarkable on a county road where unremarkable mattered. They didn't stop. They drove the perimeter once, slow, and came back with enough information for an assessment. The farmhouse was occupied. Recent occupation, generators, vehicles partially concealed by the barn, no obvious external security which meant internal security, which meant people who had assessed the property and decided their assets were better protected by not advertising the protection. This was Kane's methodology, not the armored visible presence that invited counter-armored response, but the ordinary-looking establishment that relied on its ordinariness. Decker came back and laid it out on the table at 6 a.m. The room looked at it. He's staging, Priest said. He's not set up yet. He's mid-assembly. Which means we have a window, Marco said. Which means we have a window, Decker confirmed. He looked at Gage. Your call. Gage looked at the address. He thought about Rachel in the stairwell. He thought about Avery's drawings on the refrigerator. He thought about Lena in Sacramento with an Iron Saints prospect she didn't know was watching her building from a car across the street. He thought about Victor Kane, who had spent 17 years being patient, and what a man who spent 17 years on a single grievance was capable of once he decided to stop being patient. We go to the farmhouse, he said. Observe only. I want to know what he's working with before we move. He paused. And I want Lena moved to a location Kane doesn't know about. Today. She's not going to like that, Decker said. I know. She's going to say no. I know. And if she says no? Gage was quiet for a moment. In the corner of the room, the old heater knocked against its housing in the rhythm that had become so familiar, it had effectively become silence. Tell her it's not a request, he said. Tell her it's a 48-hour ask. Tell her... He stopped. Tell her I said please. Decker looked at him. Something shifted in his VP's face. Not pity. Decker was not a man who dealt in pity, but something adjacent. Recognition, maybe. The look of a man who has watched another man carry something for a very long time and understands finally that the carrying is no longer about the weight. I'll call her myself, Decker said. Gage nodded. He looked at the table. He looked at the address. 31 hours had been enough for Kane to stage a farmhouse operation. In 31 hours, they'd gotten an address and a window. That was better than he'd expected and worse than he needed. And the math between those two things was the math that kept the room at the table instead of going home. He was still looking at the address when his phone buzzed. Tommy. The message was 4 words. She didn't come out. He read it again. The room was still talking. Decker was laying out observation protocols. Marco was marking routes on the county map. Priest was saying something about the barn's sightlines. And all of it continued while Gage read the 4 words a second time and understood what they meant and felt the specific terrible clarity of a man who has made one assumption too many and is now inside the consequences. Tommy had been on Lena's building since 6 p.m. Her lights had gone on at 7. She hadn't come out for a run at her usual time. 7:30, same route. Tommy had documented it for 3 days. 7:30 came and went. He'd waited an hour. 8:30. Then he'd sent the message. Gage stood up. Everyone at the table stopped. "Lena," he said. And that was the only word he needed, because the room understood from the shape of it, from the particular quality of silence that followed it, that the window they'd been calculating had just closed, and the thing they'd been trying to prevent had already begun. And there was no longer a 48-hour clock. There was no clock at all. There was only now and the farmhouse outside Wasco, and the specific ice-cold knowledge that Victor Kane had not been building toward a threat. He had already made his move. They were on the road in 4 minutes. Not all of them. Gage, Decker, Priest, and Marco. The 4 bikes pulling out of the machine shop lot in a tight column with no lights, until they hit the county road, the cold December air hitting like a wall at 60 miles per hour. The sky was the particular pre-dawn gray of inland California in winter, low and featureless and indifferent, the kind of sky that doesn't respond to urgency. The farms on either side of the road were dark shapes against darker fields. Somewhere behind them, 7 was staying with the remaining club members and managing the Delano Heights rotation, because Rachel and Avery were still home, and that fact needed defending regardless of what was happening everywhere else. Gage rode with the specific quality of a man who has set aside everything that is not the next mile. The grief and the guilt and the 17 years of accumulated consequence, all of that was still there. But it had been pushed below the operational surface, down into the cold dark, where he kept things that he couldn't afford to feel yet. He would feel them later. He had a long history of things he was going to feel later. Lena's building was a 4-story walk-up in a neighborhood of Sacramento that had been described at various points as transitional, which was the real estate word for a place where the older residents couldn't afford to leave and the newer ones were waiting to see which direction the market moved. Tommy's car was parked across from the entrance, the engine running, the young man inside with both hands on the wheel, and the look on his face of someone who has recognized that a routine assignment has become something other than routine, and is managing his response to that recognition with imperfect success. Gage pulled up beside him and rolled his window down. "Walk me through it." Tommy was 23 and had been with the Saints for 14 months, long enough to know how to keep his voice level when he was afraid, and short enough that the effort still showed. Lights on at 7, like always. No movement at the windows after 7:20. I never saw anyone enter after she got home. She came in at 6:50, same route from the transit stop. Nothing unusual. At 7:30, she didn't come out for the run. I waited. 8:30, still nothing. I sent the message. He paused. "I should have called sooner." "You did right," Gage said. "Stay here." He and Decker went in the front entrance. The building super was not available at 6:40 a.m., which was expected. The door to the 3rd floor was unlocked, which was not. The mechanism was intact, which meant the lock had been opened properly, not forced, which meant either a key or someone who knew locks well enough to make a key irrelevant. Lena's apartment was 3C. The door was closed. Gage stood in front of it for a moment with Decker at his shoulder and the hallway light buzzing above them. A fluorescent tube in the same genre as the one in Mercy Regional's parking structure. The cheap institutional lighting that flickered in cold buildings in winter. He knocked. Nothing. He tried the handle. Unlocked. The apartment was empty. Not ransacked. And this was the thing that hit him first. The absence of the visible evidence of struggle. Everything in its place. Her jacket on the hook inside the door. The running shoes by the mat, which meant she hadn't gone out voluntarily via the front. A coffee cup on the counter, half full. The coffee cold enough that it had been there at least 2 hours. Her phone was on the kitchen table. Her phone was on the table. Gage picked it up. No password. Lena had never used a password on her phone, a habit from her years of field work with an environmental nonprofit where quick access mattered. He opened the messages. The last text was to a contact listed as D. Decker, he registered distantly. Sent at 7:08 p.m. Tell him I said no. Sent 11 minutes after she'd gotten home. 22 minutes before her lights had stopped showing movement. Decker stood in the kitchen doorway. He was very still. She said no, he said, mostly to himself. I know. She was going to stay. I know. Gage set the phone back on the table exactly as he'd found it, face down. He looked at the coffee cup. He looked at the running shoes by the door. He looked at the window above the kitchen sink, which faced the building's internal courtyard. A narrow concrete space between wings, 3 stories down, with a service exit at the ground level on the east side. He went to the window and looked down. The courtyard was empty. The service exit was ajar. Below the window, on the second-floor fire escape landing, something caught the thin morning light, a small, dark shape against the metal grate. He went through the window and down the fire escape without discussion, Decker following, and crouched on the second-floor landing and picked up what he'd seen. A button. Black, 4-hole, the kind that came off a men's jacket. Not Lena's. Fairly new, no oxidation on the metal thread holes, which meant recent, which meant last night. He held it in his palm and looked at it and thought about the specific patience required to take someone out of their own apartment without leaving evidence of force, which meant compliance, which meant leverage, which meant they'd had something on her before they'd come. He had her before last night, Gage said. Decker crouched beside him and looked at the button. What do you mean? He had something on her, something she cared about enough to go quietly. He looked at the service exit below. She didn't fight. Lena fights. If she didn't fight, she made a calculation. What calculation? Gage looked at the courtyard. The thin winter light was flat and cold and honest. That going with them was better than the alternative he offered. They drove to the farmhouse outside Wasco because it was the only address they had. And in the absence of other information, you move toward what you know. The 4 bikes on the county road in the early morning with the fields on both sides going brown and dormant, and the sky still that low, featureless gray, moving at speed because speed was the only thing that felt like action. Priest was on his phone for most of the ride, a thing that required a specific kind of concentration on a moving motorcycle in cold air. And when they stopped on the gravel shoulder, half a mile from the farmhouse address, he had more. Kane's been in California for 6 weeks, Priest said. He had the particular flat delivery of a man who presents information without editorializing, which was one of the qualities that made him useful and also slightly unnerving. Not continuous, in and out. Sacramento, Bakersfield, Fresno. He's using a property management company as cover. Residential rentals. Looks clean from the outside. The farmhouse is registered to one of the LLCs. What else? Decker said. Priest looked at Gage. He's got a partner. Not an operator. A financial partner. Someone providing infrastructure. Who? Still running it down. He paused. But the financial trail goes through a holding company that has an address in Bakersfield. The 4 of them were standing on the gravel shoulder in the cold morning with their bikes behind them and the farmhouse out of sight beyond a low rise and the wind moving through the dead crop stubble on both sides of the road with a sound like something being slowly torn. Bakersfield, Marco said. Yeah, Priest said. No one said the next thing. They were all doing the same calculation, which was the list of people with Bakersfield interests and sufficient resources to provide infrastructure to Victor Kane. And the list was not long, and some of the names on it were uncomfortable. Say it, Gage said. Priest looked at him. The holding company is connected to Darren Webb. The name fell into the morning air, and nobody moved. Darren Webb was not an enemy. That was the problem. Darren Webb was a man with whom the Iron Saints had maintained a functional working relationship for 11 years. Not friendship, not alliance, but the kind of careful mutual accommodation that exists between entities that share territory and have found non-conflict more profitable than conflict. He ran legitimate businesses, construction mostly, a trucking company. He'd given money to local campaigns. He coached youth baseball. He was also, according to the very clean, very patient financial architecture that Priest had been unwinding for the past 40 minutes, apparently funding Victor Kane's return. Gage stood on the gravel shoulder and felt something settle in him that was not quite anger and not quite surprise, and was more like the recognition of a pattern that had been present for a long time, but that he had not been looking at with sufficient directness. "Webb's been in Bakersfield our whole existence," he said. "Yeah," Priest said. 11 years of accommodation." "Yeah." "He was waiting," Marco said quietly. "For Kane to have a reason," Decker said. He looked at Gage. 17 years ago, when Kane disappeared, Webb gave him somewhere to go, someone to wait with. Gage looked at the low rise between them and the farmhouse. The wind moved through the crop stubble. Somewhere very far south, a freight train was audible, a low bass note that traveled through the cold air with the unhurried patience of things that move on fixed rails and don't need to decide direction. "Webb's been feeding him information," Gage said, "the whole time. Everything Kane knows about our operation, about Rachel, about Avery, about Lena's location, it came through Webb." Nobody argued with this. It had the quality of a thing that had been true for a while and was now simply visible. "We have a rat," Marco said. "We have a pipeline," Decker corrected. "Webb's not inside, but he's been talking to someone who is." The word is sat in the cold air, not was, is, present tense. Someone currently inside the Iron Saints had been feeding Darren Webb, who had been feeding Victor Kane, for a duration that none of them could currently calculate, and that could be months or could be years. And the difference between those two timelines was the difference between a manageable wound and something that had been poisoning the architecture of the club from the inside for a very long time. Gage looked at Decker. Decker looked back. Between them, in the particular language of two men who have worked together for 20 years, and have developed a communication that runs well below the surface of speech, an understanding past. Not about who, not yet, but about the fact of it, and about what the fact of it meant for every decision they'd made in the past 6 weeks that they'd believed was secure. "The farmhouse," Gage said. "We observe, nothing else, and we say nothing on any channel that's been open in the last month." They didn't need to observe for long. The farmhouse was a working property. Or had been. The fields were fallow now, the irrigation equipment rusting in the winter stillness, the barn doors slightly ajar showing the darkness inside. 3 vehicles parked near the barn. 2 dark SUVs and a pickup, all current model years, none with plates visible from the rise where Gage and Priest were belly down in the dead grass with a pair of field binoculars. 2 men outside. They moved with the economy of professionals, not the theatrical watchfulness of people performing security, but the genuine low-energy presence of men who had been doing this long enough that competence had become metabolic. They changed position every 20 minutes. They didn't smoke. Gage watched them for 40 minutes. Then the farmhouse door opened and a third figure came out, and Gage adjusted the binoculars, and everything that had been building in him since Tommy's 4-word message, the cold, functional anger, the stripped-down focus, all of it, was briefly, completely arrested by what he was looking at. The figure was Lena. She was walking under her own power, which meant she was physically unharmed, which was the first thing he assessed, and the thing his body needed before it would let him assess anything else. She had her hands in her jacket pockets, and she was talking to a 4th figure who had come out behind her, a man Gage recognized even at this distance and through binoculars from a 17-year-old memory, because Victor Kane was not a man whose physical presence diminished with time. He was taller than Gage remembered, or the years had changed his bearing. He held himself with the particular upright quality of someone who has spent a long time thinking of himself as inevitable. Lena was talking to him, not resisting, not performing compliance for an observer, actually talking with the body language of someone engaged in a genuine conversation. Gage lowered the binoculars. He lay in the dead grass for 3 seconds and let the image settle into him and felt the specific way it rearranged his understanding of the situation. "She knows him," Priest said very quietly, beside him. "Yes," Gage said. "Not new." "No." He raised the binoculars again. Lena had turned away from Kane now and was looking out over the fallow field. Her profile was clear and still. "Not new at all." They pulled back to the road, and Gage sat on his bike with the engine off for a long moment. Decker didn't push. This was one of the things about Decker. He had the patience to let a hard thing be hard for the necessary amount of time before requiring a response. Marco lit a cigarette and stood downwind. Priest watched the rise in the direction of the farmhouse with the automatic vigilance of a man who doesn't stop watching just because the immediate observation has ended. "She called him," Gage said finally. "Or he called her, before all this started." "You don't know that," Decker said. "She went quietly. She left her phone, she knew I'd check it. The last text was to you at 7:08. She had enough time between getting home and them arriving to make a call she didn't want recorded." He looked at the dead field on the other side of the road. "She made a deal." "What kind of deal?" Marco said. "I don't know yet." He started the bike. The engine turned over in the cold air, the exhaust a white plume that dispersed immediately in the wind. "But she thought it was better than what I would have offered." He rode back toward Bakersfield without another word, and the others followed, because there was nothing else to say that wouldn't make it worse, and all of them knew it. He said, he called Rachel from the parking lot of a gas station on Highway 99. He needed to hear her voice before he walked back into the clubhouse. He recognized this as a need rather than a tactical decision, which was itself a piece of information about what the past 6 weeks had done to his interior architecture. She answered on the second ring. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Is she alive?" "Yes." He heard her exhale, long, controlled, the specific release of someone who has been holding their breath at a measured rate while they waited. "Tell me the rest later," she said. "Avery's up. I don't want her to hear your voice and know something's wrong." "How does she know?" "She's 8, Rachel said. "She knows everything." He almost said something else. The sentence was partially formed, something about what he'd seen at the farmhouse, something about Lena and Kane and the shape of a betrayal he didn't yet fully understand. And he stopped it before it reached speech, because Rachel was right. Not now. Not in pieces. "Later," he said. "Later," she agreed. "Be careful." He sat with the dead phone in his hand for a moment, the gas station's fluorescent canopy buzzing above him, the California morning going fully gray and cold and flat, a semi pulling out of the lot with the deep complaint of an engine underload. He went back to the clubhouse. Yim. The meeting was different from the morning's church. There were more people and less structure, which was how it went when the situation had moved faster than the protocol. Men around the table and along the walls, the room smelling of coffee and cigarette smoke, and the particular tension that accumulates in enclosed spaces when everyone present understands that something has gone wrong and no one yet knows the full shape of it. Gage stood at the head of the table. He told them about Lena. He told them about what he'd seen at the farmhouse. Her walking, talking, apparently there of her own volition, in whatever sense volition operated in a situation with this much leverage. He told them about Darren Webb and the financial trail. He told them that there was a pipeline from inside the club outward. The room absorbed this in the particular way that rooms absorb information that indicts them. Not silence, exactly. There was movement, the shift of bodies, the clink of a coffee mug, a sharp intake of breath from somewhere on the left. But underneath all of it, a new quality. The quality of people who have just been told that the walls they trusted are thinner than they thought. "Who's the pipeline?" someone said. From the far end of the table. Gage looked up. The man who'd spoken was Danny Reyes. Patched 6 years, had served as road captain before Marco, was now in a support role managing club properties. A man Gage had never had a specific reason to doubt and several reasons to trust. "Working on it," Decker said. "We should work faster," Danny said. "Meaning what?" Marco said. "Meaning there's someone in this room who's been feeding a man who just took the president's daughter, and we're working on it." His voice had the particular edge of a man who is genuinely frightened and is converting the fear into aggression, because aggression is more manageable. "We should put it on the table. Everyone here, right now." "That's not how this works," Decker said. "Tell me how it works then. Because from where I'm sitting, Danny," Gage's voice was not loud. The room went quiet. "Sit down." Danny looked at him. His jaw was tight. He was 34 and built like a former athlete who had stopped training 5 years ago, and the energy in him right now was the energy of a man trying to decide between two forms of helplessness. He sat down. No one in this room gets accused without evidence, Gage said. That's not generosity. That's how we stay functional under pressure. The moment we start pointing at each other without proof is the moment Kane wins without doing anything else. He looked at the room. Priest has a thread. We're going to follow it. Until it leads somewhere, we work as if the room is clean. He looked at every face, one at a time. Some of them held the look. Some of them shifted. That was information too, but not necessarily the kind that meant guilt. Fear made people look away, and there was enough fear in the room to account for all the averted eyes. What he was doing underneath the speech was memorizing the specific configuration of every face in this room at this moment, because the person who had been feeding Webb would have a particular relationship to this information, and people with particular relationships to information show it in small ways, and Gage Mercer had spent 30 years learning to read small ways. He thought he saw something. One face, briefly, before it composed itself. A small thing, a tightening, a calculation running visibly behind the eyes for less than a second. He said nothing. He filed it. We're going to get Lena back, he said to the room. We're going to close Kane down, and we're going to do it without becoming what he thinks we are. He paused. Any questions? Nobody spoke. Good, he said. Get to work. He found the thread himself, which was perhaps how it was always going to go. The financial trail Priest had been following ran through Webb's holding company, and the Iron Saints had access to Webb's communications through a channel that had originally been established for benign purposes, a shared property lease in the industrial corridor that had required coordinated documentation for 3 years. The access was narrow, and it was old, and it was the kind of thing that gets forgotten when the original purpose recedes, which was exactly why it was still open. Priest had been pulling communication logs for 2 hours when Gage sat down beside him and looked at the screen. The messages were not incriminating in the obvious way. They were careful. The language of people who have been doing this long enough to know that explicit language is a liability. References to the schedule, to the property, to our mutual friend's timeline, dated across a 7-month period, and the number Webb had been texting was registered to a prepaid phone purchased in Fresno. A prepaid phone was not useful by itself, but the purchase date was, and the cell tower data attached to the number's activity, which Priest had obtained through a contact at a regional carrier whose name he would not under any circumstances disclose, placed the phone in a specific geography. Bakersfield, mostly. But 3 times in the past 4 months, the phone had pinged towers that covered a single specific location, the Iron Saints Clubhouse. Gage looked at the tower data. He looked at the dates. He looked at the timestamp of the most recent ping, which was 46 days ago, and cross-referenced it against the club's meeting log, which Decker kept with the diligence of a man who understood that records were the only thing standing between organization and entropy. 46 days ago, there had been a council meeting. He pulled the attendance record. 14 members. He looked at the list. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the cell tower radius again, which covered an area approximately 7 blocks in diameter, centered on the industrial corridor. One person on the attendance list lived in the cell tower's radius. One person had a residential address that placed them, on a normal evening, within range of the tower without requiring them to be at the clubhouse specifically. He sat with this for 3 minutes. He was making sure. He owed the sitting with it to 20 years of judgment, to the agreement he'd made in this room about evidence, to the faces he'd looked at this morning and the one face he'd filed. Then he stood up and found Decker and told him quietly, in the hallway outside the main room, who it was. Decker's face did the thing it did when he received information that required structural adjustment. A stillness, followed by a single slow blink, followed by the restoration of the careful surface. "You're sure," Decker said. "I'm sure enough to move on it and find out. If you're wrong, I know. And if you're right, I know that too." Gage looked at the hallway wall, the old brick, the mortar lines, the particular texture of something that had been built to last and had lasted. "Get him alone. No announcement. Just get him in the back room." Decker looked at him. "How do you want to handle it?" "Carefully," Gage said, "because if he knows we know, Kane finds out before we can use the advantage. And Lena is still at that farmhouse." Decker absorbed this. He nodded once, the minimal nod of a man accepting a weight rather than simply acknowledging information. "Danny?" he said. "Danny?" Gage confirmed. See, the back room of the machine shop was where the club stored things that didn't have a better home. Spare parts, old documents in bankers' boxes, 3 chairs that had been replaced in the main room and hadn't yet been thrown away. It smelled of machine oil and old paper. The single overhead bulb was an incandescent yellow, without a shade, so the light it threw was direct and unflattered and honest about everything it touched. Danny Reyes came in because Decker told him the president needed to see him privately about the Webb situation. And Danny came because not coming would have been more conspicuous than whatever he was feeling, and Gage watched him come through the door and saw the specific quality of controlled normalcy that people produce when they are performing the absence of guilt rather than actually experiencing it. Gage was sitting in one of the old chairs. Decker stood at the door. Marco was outside it. Danny looked around the room and then looked at Gage, and the controlled normalcy shifted very slightly at the edges. "Sit down," Gage said. Danny sat in the chair across from him. The overhead bulb threw both their faces into the same flat, honest light. "I'm going to tell you something," Gage said, "and I need you to listen to the whole thing before you say anything." Danny's hands were on his knees, his jaw was very tight. "I know about the phone," Gage said. "I know about Webb, I know the timeline." He paused. "I need to know about Lena." The room was very quiet, the oil smell and the old paper and the yellow light. Danny's hands moved on his knees. Once, a small adjustment, the kind of movement that happens when the body wants to stand and the mind overrides it. "It wasn't," he started. "Don't tell me what it wasn't," Gage said. His voice was very quiet. "Tell me what it was." A silence, long enough that the overhead bulb's faint electrical hum became audible. "He approached me 8 months ago," Danny said. His voice had the flattened quality of someone who has rehearsed a version of a conversation and is now in a version he didn't prepare for. "Through Webb. I didn't know it was Kane at first. I thought it was a property dispute. Webb wanted information about club assets near the industrial corridor. I thought it was..." He stopped. "I thought it was business." "When did you know it wasn't business?" 3 months ago. "And you kept going." Danny looked at the floor. "He had something on me. Before I knew who he was, before I understood, I'd given Webb information about the corridor properties, enough that Kane could use it to build a picture of our operations." He stopped. "He told me if I stopped, he'd give everything to the DA." "So you kept feeding him?" "I kept..." He pressed his hands flat against his knees. "I kept it as small as I could. I told myself I was minimizing." "You told him about Rachel," Gage said. Not a question. Danny's jaw moved. "I told Webb about the Quinn situation. I didn't know..." "You told him about Avery." The words were flat and very precise. Danny looked up. His face had the particular devastated quality of a man who has been constructing, for months, a version of his own actions that he could live with, and is watching it disassemble in real time. "I didn't know he'd target a child. I didn't think..." "You didn't think," Gage said. The room was very still. Gage looked at Danny Reyes for a long moment. He looked at a man he'd patched in 6 years ago, who'd ridden 2,000 miles for a brother's funeral without being asked, who'd sat at this table through hard meetings and harder rides, and who had, 8 months ago, made a decision that he'd spent every day since trying to fold small enough to fit inside a version of himself he could still recognize. He knew what that kind of folding cost. He'd done it himself. Different decisions, different years, but the same internal accounting, the same daily renegotiation with the mirror. It didn't change what had to happen next. "Lena," he said. "Tell me what you know about Lena." Danny looked at him with the full weight of everything he'd been holding. Kane reached out to her 6 weeks ago, through her environmental work. She'd been researching a land dispute in the Central Valley that overlapped with one of Webb's properties. Kane offered her information. She didn't know who he was. He paused. "She went to the farmhouse last night because she thought she was meeting a source, not because she made a deal. She walked into it clean." The relief was physical. It moved through Gage's chest like something unclenching. He sat with it for exactly the time it required, and then he set it aside and returned to the room and the light and the man across from him. She's still there because Kane needed the leverage, Gage said. Because he knew I'd find out she was gone. Yes, Danny said. He wanted me to come for her. Yes. The farmhouse is the trap. Danny looked at him, and in his eyes was the specific expression of a man who is about to say the thing that will cost him everything, because not saying it will cost something larger. The farmhouse is part of the trap, Danny said. He's not there, Gage. Kane's not at the farmhouse. He's been in Bakersfield for 3 days. He stopped. He's been watching the Quinn apartment since Tuesday, not his people. He was already moving before Danny finished the sentence. Not Kane's people. Him. The word him hung in the yellow light of the back room, and Gage was through the door before its full weight landed, through the main room with his keys in his hand and Decker 2 steps behind him, calling his name with the specific urgency of a man who understands that the person he's calling is past the point where names work. His phone was already at his ear, Rachel's number, 3 rings, 4. No answer. He hit the door of the machine shop and the December air came at him like a fist, and he was on the bike before Decker reached the parking lot, the engine turning over hard in the cold, the exhaust white and immediate. His hands on the grips were steady. Everything else in him was not. Decker grabbed the handlebar. You go in alone. He wins. She's not answering. I know. 2 minutes. Let us saddle up. 2 minutes was an eternity, and Decker knew it and was asking anyway, which meant Decker believed 2 minutes mattered, and Gage trusted Decker's math even when his own body was refusing to run the numbers. He kept the engine running. He looked at the parking lot exit and held himself on the bike through the specific discipline of a man who has learned that the difference between useful action and chaos is the 30 seconds nobody wants to spend. 90 seconds. 8 bikes. They rode. That's it. The lights were on in apartment 3B when they turned onto Beaumont Street. This was good. This meant something. He cataloged it at 50 miles per hour and didn't let it slow him because lights on could mean several things, and only one of them was the one he needed it to mean. 7 had called ahead. 7, who'd been managing the Delano Heights rotation, who'd had 2 men in the lot. The lot was empty when they pulled in. Both men gone. The rotation vehicle, sus Marco's cousin's borrowed truck, was parked at the wrong angle, the driver door open, the interior light on, painting a yellow rectangle on the cold asphalt. Nobody in the truck. Gage was off the bike before it fully stopped, Decker and Priest flanking, the other 5 spreading across the lot in the practice configuration of men who have cleared spaces before and understand instinctively how to cover angles without instruction. The building's front entrance. He hit it hard, the repaired lock, his own work, 6 weeks ago, holding perfectly, the door swinging clean. Stairs, 2nd floor. The hallway with its buzzing fluorescent and the smell of other people's cooking and the low television sound from 2A that was always on. He stopped at 3B. He pressed his palm flat against the door and listened. Voices. 2. One was Rachel's, the other was male, unhurried, with the particular measured quality of someone conducting rather than reacting. The cadence of a man who believes he has already won the significant contest and is now managing the details. Gage stepped back and looked at Decker. Decker held up 3 fingers, then 2, then 1. The door came in on the frame, not the lock, the frame itself, because Gage hit it at the hinge side with the full weight of a man who'd been carrying 17 years of consequence and had just been handed permission to set it down. Kane was standing at the kitchen table. He was exactly as Gage had seen him through binoculars at the farmhouse, tall, upright, the bearing of someone accustomed to rooms reorganizing around his presence. He had one hand resting on the table's surface and the other at his side, and he was wearing a gray jacket, good quality, the kind of jacket that announces considered taste rather than wealth. He looked like someone's attorney. He looked like someone who had never been in a back room under a yellow bulb in his life. Rachel was at the counter, standing, not restrained, which registered in Gage's chest as a second physical unclenching in one morning. She had a kitchen knife in her hand, held low, not raised, the grip of someone who had picked it up and decided to keep it, rather than someone performing threat. Her eyes found Gage the moment the door came in, and the look they exchanged lasted less than a second and contained more information than most conversations. Avery was not in the room. The bedroom door was closed. There she is, Kane said. He was not looking at Rachel. He was looking at Gage. The expression, I mean. I'd forgotten what you look like when something actually matters to you. Gage said nothing. He stood in the broken doorframe with Decker behind him and the hallway behind Decker, and he looked at Victor Kane across a kitchen table and felt the specific coldness that comes when anger has burned through all its own heat and left something more durable underneath. You came alone, Kane said. Well, you brought company, but you came personally. That's the distinction. He tilted his head slightly. 17 years ago, you didn't come personally. You sent people. That's what cost you everything. Where's my daughter? Gage said. Safe. Genuinely, I want you to know that. Lena is not part of the harm here. Kane's voice was even. She was part of the demonstration. There's a difference. A demonstration of what? That I can reach anything you love. He said it simply, without theater. I don't need to hurt Lena. I need you to understand that I could have. The understanding is the point. Gage took one step into the kitchen. Kane didn't move. My brother, Kane said, was 23 years old. I know how old he was. You know the number. You don't know him. Something shifted in Kane's face. Not grief, exactly, because this man had processed grief 17 years ago, and what was left was the structural alteration that grief leaves when it hardens. He was 23 and he was trying to get out of the business, and the only reason he was in that warehouse was because I asked him to be. And the only reason he died was because you decided that night to be a different kind of man than you'd been the day before. The kitchen was very still. Decker hadn't moved. Rachel hadn't moved. The knife was still low in her hand. You decided to protect your people, Kane said. Noble. I've never called it anything else. You protected your people and my brother died for it, and then a jury agreed with you, and then you walked out of a courthouse and rebuilt everything and I had nothing. He paused. So I built something new. Took a while. Patience is a skill. You targeted a child, Gage said. I targeted you. She's 8 years old, and she is completely unharmed and will remain so. Kane's voice was flat and final. I'm not a man who hurts children, Mercer. I'm a man who makes other men understand what it means to have something worth losing. He looked at Rachel briefly, then back. You understand now? That was the demonstration. What do you want? Gage said. I want you to walk away from Kern County. Kane reached into his jacket. Decker moved, hand going back, and Kane paused with deliberate patience and produced a folded document, set it on the table. There's a property dispute currently in county court. 11 acres in the industrial corridor. Webb's company has a legitimate claim. Your club has been blocking the resolution for 3 years through a combination of legal obstruction and physical presence. He looked at Gage. Walk away from it. Let the court process run. That's all. Gage looked at the document. He looked at Kane. That's all, he said. That's all. The kitchen hummed with the refrigerator, and the cold coming through the broken front door, and the specific silence of 4 people who are each running a different calculation in the same room. Gage knew what the 11 acres were. He knew why the club had been blocking the resolution. The industrial corridor property wasn't about territory. It was the access route to a distribution network that Webb had been building for 3 years, the thing that would make Webb's operation viable at a scale it currently couldn't reach. Letting the court process run wasn't a property concession. It was handing Webb an operational infrastructure that would, within 18 months, compromise every county between Bakersfield and Fresno. He looked at the document. He thought about Avery behind the closed bedroom door, who had been woken by the sound of a door coming off its frame and was sitting on her bed right now listening to adult voices with the particular focused attention of a child who knows that what is being decided in the next room concerns her. He thought about Rachel with the knife held low. He thought about Lena at a farmhouse, who'd walked into a trap clean, who was 26 and estranged and alive. He picked up the document. Kane watched him. Gage looked at the document for a long moment, long enough that the room shifted. Decker's weight moved slightly, a small readjustment of a man prepared for multiple outcomes. Rachel's grip on the knife changed. Kane's chin came up a fraction of an inch, the involuntary movement of a man anticipating resolution. Gage folded the document once, along its original crease, and set it back on the table. No, he said. Kane's face stilled. You understand what I'm telling you I can do. I understand what you think you can do, Gage said, and I understand that you've spent 17 years building toward this room, this table, this conversation. And I'm telling you that everything you built pointed in the wrong direction. He looked at Kane steadily. You came here to show me I have something worth losing. You're right, I do. He paused. That means I have something worth fighting for. You never did the math on that part. The room was absolutely still. Kane looked at him, and for the first time in the conversation, something moved in his face that was not controlled, not performed, not the careful architecture of a 17-year grievance, finally, in the room where it belonged. Something that was closer to surprise. The surprise of a man who has spent so long being right about one thing that he failed to account for the ways in which being right about one thing leaves you wrong about everything adjacent to it. His hand moved toward his jacket. Decker was faster. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and had Kane's wrist before the hand completed its trajectory, and Kane did not fight it. He stood very still, his wrist in Decker's grip, his eyes still on Gage with that newly altered expression. Tell me where Lena is, Gage said. Exactly. Right now. Kane looked at him for a long moment, and then, from the bedroom, came Avery's voice. Small and clear, cutting through the stillness of the kitchen with the precision of something that does not know it is interrupting. Mom, is he staying for breakfast? The question hung in the cold air of the broken apartment, and Kane looked at the closed bedroom door, and something in his face changed in a way that Gage had not anticipated and could not immediately name, something that moved through the controlled surface like a current under ice. And when Kane looked back at Gage, his jaw was set differently than it had been, and the document on the table sat between them in the flat morning light, and outside on Beaumont Street the sound of more Harleys arriving was building from a distance into something that filled the cold air. The Harleys arrived like weather, not violence. That was the thing Kane heard first, standing in the broken kitchen with Decker's hand on his wrist, and the document on the table and the child's voice still dissolving in the cold air. Not the aggressive thunder of machines being used as weapons, just arrival, the sound of things coming home. He looked at the window. Through the glass in the gray December morning, the parking lot was filling. Bikes pulling in one by one, and then in pairs, cutting engines, men dismounting in silence. Old men and young men, and men in between, all of them in the same cuts, all of them standing in the cold without urgency, facing the building. Not a mob, not a threat display, just presence. The specific, patient, immovable presence of people who have decided where they stand and are prepared to stand there for as long as standing is required. Kane looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at the document on the table. Then he sat down in one of Rachel's kitchen chairs, not because Decker forced him. Decker had released his wrist, but because something had gone out of his posture, quietly, the way air goes out of something that has been held taut for a very long time and then isn't. The farmhouse, he said. Route 4, mile marker 31. There's a woman in the back bedroom. She has her phone. He paused. She was never in danger. I need you to know that was true. I'll verify it myself, Gage said. I know you will. Gage looked at him. This man who had spent 17 years building a careful architecture of grievance and patience and infrastructure, and who was sitting now in a nurse's kitchen chair under a fluorescent light with the sound of 80 motorcycles in the parking lot below, and who looked, not defeated exactly, because defeat implied a contest that had been fairly wagered, and this had not been that. He looked like a man who had arrived somewhere he'd been moving toward for a very long time, and found that the destination was not what the journey had promised. Your brother, Gage said. I'm sorry he died. Kane looked at him. The words landed in the room and neither of them moved. That doesn't, Kane started. I know, Gage said. It doesn't change it. I'm saying it anyway. A silence. The refrigerator hummed. The parking lot outside held its quiet mass of men and machines. Somewhere in it, a single engine turned over briefly and then cut, and the silence after it was fuller than the silence before. Kane looked at the table. I had 17 years, he said, and this is where they went. Nobody answered him. There was nothing to answer. It was simply true, and true things sometimes need a room to sit in before anyone can move. Decker took the document from the table and folded it into his cut pocket. Kane didn't watch him do it. Jim, the county sheriff's substation in Delano, took the call at 7:42 a.m. from an anonymous source providing specific coordinates, specific names, and specific documentation of a financial conspiracy involving a holding company, a property dispute, and a 17-year criminal enterprise. The documentation was thorough. Priest had been building it for weeks, which was the thing about Priest. He was always building something, and it arrived at the substation via a secure digital drop that would take the department's tech coordinator most of the morning to trace, and that would ultimately resolve to nothing useful. Victor Kane was detained at the Delano Heights parking lot by 2 county deputies at 8:15 a.m., having waited in the parking lot for their arrival because Gage had asked him to, and because, in the end, Kane was a man who honored the logic of conclusions even when the conclusion was his own. Darren Webb's offices in Bakersfield were served with a civil investigatory subpoena by 9 a.m. The property case in Kern County was suspended pending review. These were not dramatic events. They happened in the flat gray morning with the particular quietness of bureaucratic machinery engaging, which was slower and less satisfying than other forms of resolution and also more durable. Lena was at the farmhouse exactly where Kane had said. Gage drove out alone. This was a decision he made without discussion and that Decker respected without comment, which was the nature of 20 years of partnership, knowing which things required presence and which required distance. She was sitting on the farmhouse porch when he pulled up, her jacket zipped to the chin, her hands around a coffee mug that had gone cold an hour ago. She watched him park. She watched him walk to the porch. She didn't stand. He sat down on the step below her, the same configuration as Rachel's front steps 6 weeks ago, and the recurrence of it was not lost on him. They sat in silence for a moment. The Central Valley stretched out around them in every direction, brown and dormant and very flat, the mountains a gray suggestion to the west under the low cloud. "I didn't know who he was," she said, "when he first contacted me." "I know. And when I found out," she stopped. "I thought if I went quietly, I could get information, something you could use." She looked at her cold coffee. "I was trying to help." "I know that too. I should have called you." "Lena, I should have called you," she said again, more quietly. Not accusation, just the plain accounting of someone deciding to be honest about the gap between what they did and what they wished they'd done. He looked at the dead fields. A hawk was working a thermal somewhere above the barn, patient and unhurried. "I'm going to need you to let me try," he said. "I'm not asking for what I didn't earn. I'm asking for the chance to earn something going forward." He paused. "That's the whole ask. You can tell me no." She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the hawk completed its circle and began another. "Coffee," she said finally. He looked at her. "There's a diner on Route 33 that opens at 6. She stood up. "I've been sitting here for 12 hours. I need actual hot coffee, and I'm not ready for a conversation longer than that." She looked down at him. Her face had his jaw and her mother's cheekbones and the specific combination that was entirely her own. "Are you coming or not?" He stood up. "Yeah," he said. "I'm coming." The diner on Route 33 was the kind of place that had been serving the same menu since 1987 and had no interest in changing it. Vinyl booths, laminate tables, coffee in ceramic mugs that were slightly too thick, the particular warmth of a space heated by a kitchen that had been running since 5 a.m. The waitress knew Lena's order without asking. She brought a second mug for Gage without comment. They sat across from each other and drank hot coffee. And outside the Route 33 dawn was just beginning to differentiate itself from the night, the horizon going from black to a deep dark blue that would eventually, with patience, become something you could call morning. They didn't talk about Kane. They didn't talk about 17 years. They talked about the hawk Gage had seen above the barn, and Lena said it was probably a redtail because they were everywhere out here in winter. And Gage said he didn't know much about hawks, and Lena said she'd spent 3 weeks in the valley last spring doing field work and had learned more about redtails than she'd ever expected to need. It was a small conversation, the smallest possible beginning, and it was real, which made it the largest thing that had happened in a very long time. Busam. Rachel was on her front steps when he got back to Delano Heights. Same gray sweater, same travel mug, same posture of someone who has decided to meet the morning rather than wait for it. He parked and walked over and sat down beside her. She handed him her travel mug without being asked. He drank her coffee and handed it back. "She okay?" Rachel said. "She's going to be. And you?" He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. The answer was not simple, and Rachel was not a woman who wanted simple answers dressed up as honesty. "Working on it," he said. "That's different from before," she said. "How?" "Before you would have said fine." She drank her coffee. "Working on it means you know the distance between where you are and where you're going. That's not nothing." He looked at the parking lot. Seven's bike was still there, 2 others from the overnight rotation. The borrowed truck had been straightened, the driver door closed. The motion sensor light above the stairwell entrance was on, burning steadily in the gray morning light in a way that made it look purposeful even when it wasn't. "Avery wants to know if you're coming to her school thing next week," Rachel said. "What school thing?" "Reading group does a presentation. Parents and whoever." She turned the mug in her hands. "She put your name on the list. I didn't tell her to." He was quiet for a moment. "What day?" he said. "Thursday." "I'll be there." Rachel looked at him. Not the assessing look, not the careful direct look. Something quieter. The look of a woman who has stopped measuring and started simply seeing. "Good," she said. The morning came up slowly over the Quick Mart and the parking lot and the empty Beaumont Street, the light gray and honest and without drama, the kind of morning that doesn't announce itself but simply arrives. Somewhere in the building above them, a door opened and closed. The smell of someone's coffee drifted down from a cracked window. A car started on the street, idled, pulled away. He sat beside her in the cold and didn't say anything else, and she didn't either. And the silence between them was the good kind, the kind that doesn't need filling, that has earned its own space, that sits between 2 people who have looked at each other clearly and decided that what they see is worth staying for. The stretch of Route 9 where it happened looks like nothing. That's the thing about it. 2 lanes of asphalt between dead orchards and scrub, a drainage ditch on the east side, a gravel shoulder that collects the debris of passing trucks. No marker. No sign. The road doesn't know what happened there. But every October, a Harley-Davidson turns off the county road and parks on the gravel shoulder, and a big man with a scarred face gets off the bike and stands at the edge of the ditch, and looks at the place in the gravel where a 53-pound child once knelt down and pressed her hands against a stranger and refused to let go. He doesn't stay long. He never needs to. He stands there until he's said what he came to say, which is nothing out loud but everything inside. And then he gets back on the bike and rides back toward the lights of a town where a woman is getting home from a late shift, and a young woman who studies red-tailed hawks and land disputes is coming for the weekend, and a drawing of a horse with an enormous head is still held to a refrigerator by a butterfly magnet. He rides toward all of it, every year, because the most dangerous man in the room turned out to be the one most afraid of becoming what everyone expected, and the only thing that ever broke that open was a child in a ditch on a lonely highway who looked at the blood and the leather and the reputation and saw, underneath all of it, someone worth saving. She was right. He spent the rest of his life trying to prove it,